we do a very bad job in Australia of really unpacking like what is a VC funded company, and what is not a VC funded company, and if it's not VC fundable, that's fine. Like can still be a fantastic business to run. It's a great outcome. Like most businesses aren't VC funded, and that's fine. And in some ways, like as a founder, like going and chasing VC money or chasing angel money, any sort of investment, that's going to kill the company more than it's going to save it. But you do definitely meet, not infrequently, I will say, you definitely do meet people that just have convinced themselves that like that's the only sign of success.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 138 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have the founder of Sked Social and the founder and general partner at Galileo Ventures, Hugh Stevens, as my guest for this episode. Hugh launched Sked Social as a solo founder in 2013. Fast forward 8 years later, and the product is now utilized by over 10,000 companies worldwide and generates millions of dollars in revenue each year, all without taking any external capital. Alongside his role at Sked Social, he is also the founder and general partner at Galileo Ventures, a $10 million venture capital firm and growth accelerator program that, on top of investing $200,000 into early stage startups, also provides 12 months of practical support, one-on-one coaching, and much more. In this interview, we covered a wide range of topics, including how to utilize constraints to your advantage, a deep dive into pricing strategies for SaaS startups, how founders should decide whether to bootstrap or raise capital for their startup, lifting the lid on the challenges that come with raising a fund, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Hugh Stevens. Hi Hugh, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
Hugh, so for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
I was initially a medical student actually, so studied something entirely outside of business and startups and anything like that. Came here to Melbourne from Sydney, studied medicine for a while, perhaps discovered, I'll say slowly, but you could say quickly in some senses, that it wasn't necessarily for me. I ended up starting a consulting firm, ran a consulting firm sort of doing risk management and strategy across, government, non-profit, usual consulting world type stuff. Did that for a few years, then sort of in parallel ended up starting a startup while simultaneously doing some work for some startups, and also worked for a little while in government. So sort of covered a lot of different bases and sort of had the typical bootstrapping journey of working for someone else while you were bootstrapping the revenue of your own business. Yeah, and then since September last year, been doing some angel investing over the last few years. Then since September last year, launched Galileo Ventures. So we launched a venture capital fund, and we've done our first lot of investment. I think we've closed 8 investments so far since September, which is pretty exciting. And that's been, I guess, the next big part of the journey really is kind of discovering the perhaps more institutional approach to investing than you do as an angel.
There's so much about your story that I want to dive into and that I'm sure we'll get into in this episode, but going back to your experience in studying medicine and deciding to start a consulting business, not necessarily the most obvious sort of career path in terms of deciding to do consulting after studying med. What was that sort of process or decision making like for you at that time?
I mean, I wish it was some sort of like I'd sort of done this big market. You talk to sort of some of the people that study business, and they sort of, you did this big market analysis and business plan. I've never written a business plan in my life.
Same.
And it was actually that I spoke at a conference a very, very long time ago. I spoke at a conference about applying medical legal risk management principles. So things like, how I guess the law considers duty of care, stuff like that, applying that to how mental health professionals can engage online, which I just thought was this kind of fascinating thing of, isn't this an interesting, like weird sort of loophole in the law that's sort of where the law isn't really up to date with perhaps the modern day practice. What does that actually mean in terms of interpreting? And someone came up to me afterwards and said, do you do this for work? And I was like, sure. And so that was kind of my first project, I guess. So, and then sort of went from there to, we did contact center optimization work, we did general business strategy work, we did obviously a lot of communications and social and digital type stuff. But it was the usual consulting thing of, you just sort of do, somewhat jokingly, I say you do whatever the client will pay you enough money to do, which is a little bit true and a little bit false in terms of consulting. But it was a really interesting time. I learned a lot of stuff, learned about a lot of different sectors that I obviously as a medical student had essentially no exposure to, and really sort of caused me to, sort of build ways of thinking. I'm very big on sort of frameworks for thinking and sort of ways of approaching different problems and standardization and what that means. And similarly, learned a lot about, learned a lot of different sectors, learned a lot about government decision making, which is a sort of fairly unique beast in itself, but did projects across consumer goods and all kinds of different sectors, and you don't normally sort of have to deal with what's the supply chain of a bottle of Coke. You don't have those problems normally in your everyday life. So it was always interesting to kind of, explore into it and, kind of gave you that sense of curiosity that you're able to always discover new things.
And I know that you kind of breezed over this in terms of what you built with what was initially called Skedogram.
It was initially called Skedogram. Never call something that's very hard to pronounce. Like, is it Skedogram? Is it Shedogram? It was one of those like .am domains where you had like the thing, and so sometimes the customers would call it Skedogur.
No.
No, the logo's the full thing.
Now known as Sked Social. Which is a very impressive business and probably something that isn't given the exposure that it probably should. But I was reading an article kind of mentioning that you, through your consulting experience, that was one of the things that you sort of identified. Can you share where the sort of original concept of that came from?
Yeah, we'd done a series of projects around kind of cost efficiency and how agencies manage, various large global clients' social media and things like that. And obviously I was sort of tapped into that part of the market in terms of people that worked in that space and things like that for a while. And, Instagram was, at the time in massive pain, taking a lot of time to manage, and I was kind of like, oh, that seems a bit weird, that's a bit silly. And, this was back in 2013, and so it was still sort of Instagram wasn't perhaps as big as it is now. Certainly was post the acquisition, I believe, but it wasn't sort of this sort of de facto number one that we would see these days. It was questionable at the time. Will Snapchat end up being the future Facebook? And so sort of built something over Christmas, New Year. You often have quiet periods in consulting over Christmas and New Year, and and then launched it in, I think it was Jan or Feb 2014. And then, sort of took off somewhat. No, I wouldn't necessarily say entirely to my surprise, but somewhat to my surprise, I'd say, yeah, it wasn't, I was expecting it to kind of be a side project. And for a while, it was in a sense a side project while its revenue grew up until it was able to sort of, pay me full time. But, I was just, surprised, I guess. And I think that was where, what I sort of talk to founders about now is I think it's like, you ideally want to be able to find those kinds of problems where your early customers, they're just so desperate for any sort of solution. And they don't mind that you're a startup. They don't mind that you're a random person in the middle of nowhere. One of our early customers was some, Italian telco, and they'd sort of found us on Google. And, I was just like, oh, wow, like we only had we had a single page website for probably 2 years, 2.5, 3 years. Yep. And we just pretty much relied on, word of mouth and recommendations from people. And it was just, for the people that had the pain point, it was a massive pain point. So I think that's where, for me, I think a lot of those, like in terms of that sort of traction curve, like how do you find and address those early adopters? Like, ideally every business should have those, like that cohort of people that are just like, desperate for a solution. And at the time we were quite lucky that, there was a decent sized customer base that was like that. And to a degree, the nice part about big markets is, there still are. So, that this is kind of how much do you go sort of niche versus broad in terms of, particularly in B2B. Yeah. So we sort of went, I guess, very niche and then eventually expanded out broadly, which is sort of a fairly typical story, I guess. You can say the same thing on Atlassian, starting in Jira and going into Confluence and everything else. I think that's something that's very worthwhile, and that, you sort of start that way, but I'm not a strong believer in the start broad and sort of be everything to everyone. I'm sort of a very big fan of the very, very niche, almost like a small, very well-defined initial customer base, because it allows you to sort of generate those brand advocates and things like that it's just very hard to otherwise get.
One of the things that I read in the in the article and doing research for this interview was that I think you mentioned your first version of your MVP was terrible.
It was, yeah.
Again, do you mind kind of sharing what that is? Because I think again, founders would sort of look at what you've built with Sked Social now and kind of look at the growth of the business over the last 8 years or so. And there's a particular impression you kind of get of something that's kind of fully formed versus understanding what did that very first version of this look like.
Yeah, we just had all of these, like, I had no idea. I had no idea. I built WordPress websites before, right? I'd done some poking around. I was sort of sufficiently technical that I could sort of smash rocks together and generate code. But at the same time, like I had no concept of the idea of UX principles. No idea about anything like that. I still have no design eye. Like, you don't ask me to choose my own clothes for the day, really. And so, we had all of these bizarre decisions, like, obviously things like, we helped you manage multiple Instagram accounts. To pick which Instagram account you were managing was like this strange, like, pillbox type thing where you had to like highlight the pillbox and it went red, like a sort of not really red, like sort of a weird danger pink color. And, it probably took, I would say, the better part of 2 years of like continuously having to explain to new customers, oh yeah, that means selected, before I was like, maybe we should actually just like use, checkboxes, or sort of start to take that perhaps regular UX approach. It took a very, very long time. Like the initial MVP was built in jQuery. That's all I could use at the time. So, it was server rendered HTML that went down the wire and was rendered on the client. And, that was just, again, smashing rocks together until it worked. And it somewhat did. So, I think we were, again, that sort of is for me is where I think, there was no time or whatever to be able to build that polished solution in the early days. And as sort of time has gone on, we've had to sort of start, fixing those things, and we've kind of experienced a lot of interesting sort of parts of that journey as well. And that, again, the benefit I think you have in early days is you can deploy, 10 times a day. Don't worry about it. In worst case, you bring down a production. You're like, oh bugger, I'd better go and fix that and then put it back up again. Whereas, you kind of get to a level of maturity and you get to a level of kind of expectation from your customers where, we now have a full QA stack, and things take forever to be able, or it feels like things take forever to get from kind of, code through to production. And even just purely design decisions, like sort of, I guess the quintessential thing I say is we can no longer just swap a button or change the color of a button or anything. We've got to actually think through what's that going to mean? And, we do change the color of a button, or, the one place where the confirm is on the right and the cancel is on the left, maybe it's the other way around somewhere in the app, and we're like, oh, we'll fix this because this is obviously wrong compared to everything else. And then you'll get 50 emails being like, oh my God, you've ruined my day. What have you done? You've moved that button. That button has always been there and now it's over there. And oh my God. And then you get another 50 being like, thank God you finally fixed that awful, UX quirk that's just annoyed the hell out of me forever. And you're like, well, you could have told me about this at some point in the last 4 years. But I think, you sort of get to that stage where you just can't really be as agile as you were in the past, which is quite tricky. And it sort of is a very different experience, I think. Managing, I want to say a mature product, but managing a more mature product, than that really bare bones MVP. And even then, I guess, the same thing of, we think about the market as this whole space of, you've got content creation, you've got content planning, you've got content scheduling, you've got content publishing, you've got, content analytics, you've got, advertising as well, and you've got a whole stack in advertising, and then you've got sort of community management, there's whole different things there. And, for a very long time, we purely just did Instagram and just did publishing, scheduling and publishing. That was all we did. We didn't do any creation. We didn't do any coordination, didn't do any community management, didn't do any analytics. It was very, very, very focused and quite narrow. And that, I guess, for me, particularly in B2B, that for me, I think that's where a lot of the best MVPs lie, is in these very, very specific point solutions that, yes, over time, grow in features and functionality. But the best things end up, starting with this very, very clear thing, because it's so much easier to say to someone, do you have this pain point? I solve this one pain point. And as soon as they can then say, oh, yeah, I've got that, here's my money. That's when I think you're really onto something, in that sort of space. Yeah,
I think especially when you have something that isn't perfect, as you mentioned, in your words, a terrible MVP, so I don't know about you, but I kind of come across a lot of founders who will focus on very sort of minute details of, is the button in the right place? But actually at the very early stages, you just need to understand, as you said, are you solving a real problem? And I think for the most part, if you're solving a real problem, customers will be willing to forego for 2 years,
Yep.
Bad UX or all of those sort of things. But if you're not solving a real problem, it's much changing the color of a button or a position of a button isn't really going to change the fundamentals of that.
Yeah, and I think it's also very different if you're launching, a new email client, right? Because you're launching a massive substitute for something that people already have. And I think, there are different expectations that customers will have as a result of that kind of decision, and sort of, I guess, the degree of polish that they expect to a degree. But at the same time, I just think that it's, a lot of founders, and particularly when you meet very, very early stage founders, and I'm sort of talking, sub 5 headcount type founders and teams, they're often sort of locked in that paralysis of this isn't good enough. And it's no, you can continuously polish your UI forever, and you should, to be clear, I've learned the benefit of having actual designers on board. But at the same time, you can end up just in this state of paralysis where nothing gets done, no one does anything, and the business just kind of falls by the wayside because you're so obsessing about button colors, or does this conform to the style guide or whatever it is. And it's you don't need a style guide. You've got 5 people. You should probably have a consistent color, but other than that, what are you worried about? Get customers.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I'm just so fascinated in general by constraints, whether sort of internal or external, or kind of forced on you, or just kind of things that are in place. So, I think the fact that you were, as you mentioned, doing this as a side project, you already had another business on the side, you were a solo founder as well. I'm wondering whether, the fact that you had such limited time available to you, that it kind of forced you to focus on, to be hyper-focused in the things that would actually sort of move the needle for you, versus, I guess, if you had more time and more resources and those sorts of things, padding out some of the other areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true, and I think certainly for me as well, I'd say it's definitely true in terms of a lot of the internal operational side, and I think a lot of founders don't, like you think and you hear and you read a lot about that sort of external operational side of like, how do I get customers and all that kind of stuff, but then kind of once you get them, you start having all those challenges of like, well, what does the sort of internal operational side of it look like? What should our engineering workflows look like as we scale up an engineering team, or how are we delivering customer support? Are we doing it via knowledge-based type stuff? Are we doing onboarding via calls like directly? Are we doing it via video? Are we doing it via those little in-app tours? Or are we just sort of like assuming that customers are going to be able to understand the product and some magical UX that I'm like in B2B anyway. But I think there's we often forget about that sort of like internal operational complexity inside. And again, always optimize for good problems, like internal operational disasters. Always a good problem to have, because it usually means you've got lots of customers or lots of revenue or lots of people, I guess, depending on you. But I think it's it's very easy to forget that as part of that whole process, and kind of constraints do end up driving that, because ultimately in the early days, most of the companies that we work with at Galileo, like they're sub 10 people. And that's, I think, where, you don't necessarily have these beautifully clear, well-defined JDs and roles and spaces that you go in and what that means. And, and that's both a kind of sometimes a really bad thing, right? Like sometimes it's really nice to be able to say to someone, this is your clear role, like, deliver these things. But, the other side is, as a team member, I guess, like I said, I spent a little bit of time in government. For me, that was very frustrating, being put in that little kind of box space. And so I think, you need to sort of have those, you have operational constraints. You always have operational constraints, but I think there's, you as a founder, and particularly you as a founder, and I guess as a manager in a sense, founders are ultimately managers at some point. You need to work out that balance of how much you want to drive, team members and teams based on, artificial or real constraints versus allowing sort of agency and, capacity to float across different teams and roles. And I think that's, that again is something that I'd say that, I guess I'm still discovering as the company continues to grow up, and we see again, we see in our companies that we're working with, and I've seen in the companies that I've worked with for a while now is, as you do mature and as you do start going from, 2-3 co-founders, through to your early hires, through to like, sort of that 10, 15 size, through to the 50 size, through to the 100 size, when do you start introducing structure? When do you start introducing process, where process at an early day will kill the company, but lacking in process in the late stages will also kill it. So it's kind of this, I think, in startups you have these continuously sort of graduated steps in all of these different attributes. And all the time you have to try and work out as a founder, are we at the right, are we the right stage? Are we at the right point in this spectrum for the company that we're, that I'm currently running? For the business stage that we're at, for the way that customers expect us to be, like sort of, I guess at a simple level, how polished should the UX be? What should that expectation look like, and how should I sort of dial that to be appropriate to the business? And so as a founder, it sort of feels like sometimes you're sort of living in this space of hundreds of little like continuous variable dials, and you've got to sort of work out like, do I have it all sort of dialed correctly? And there's no right or wrong answer. There's no easy feedback.
No, exactly. And it's so different for every company as well, depending on, the market that you're in, what your competitors are like, if you have competitors at all, whether you're kind of forging something new or all of those sort of things as well. One of the really interesting bits of information that I sort of picked up in doing research for this was spoke to Nathan Murphy, who is someone who you're very close to. He mentioned that one of the best bits of advice that he's gotten from you as a mentor for his business is on pricing. And he mentioned particularly for bootstrapped founders, the usual playbook is offer a freemium model, so you've got a bunch of users that will sign up. But the feedback that you provided to him, correct me if I'm wrong, is that's not a great outcome usually for bootstrap founders, because there is this whole serviceability that you then need to do for this free user base. And you should charge your customers, because then you're focusing your energy on actual paying customers who have a big enough, are seeing this as a big enough pain point that they're actually willing to pay for this. Can you sort of elaborate in like what that sort of means and how you structure that for yourself, or advice that you give to other founders? I
mean, everyone always says you charge too little, right? And I've said it 100 times to other people, but it's like at the same time, I've had it like, you go through these periods where like you're something like, oh, we should probably think about pricing, and suddenly you put prices up by like 40% and just nothing changes. And you're like, oh God, I've just like left 40% of money on the table for quite a long time. But I've always hated freemium models. Again, in the bootstrapping world, Wistia is probably a good example where, they're like Vimeo, they're sort of a video hosting company that's very B2B focused. And they had for a very long time, no freemium model, no free plan. And then they actually wrote quite a good post about their free plan when they launched it back in, I don't know, it would have been like 2016-ish, something like that. And they wrote about how, like, they'd sort of reached a point where financially they could support a freemium model. And up until then, they just purely couldn't because of both the fact that it costs a lot of money to host video content. Like you've got to store it places, you've got to have a CDN, you've got to, make sure it's actually distributed. And it costs money to support the customers, all those sort of things. And they sort of said, we've finally reached a scale where actually we're sort of almost profitable enough. We have enough cash flow to be able to justify a free model, and then obviously the benefits that comes with. But I agree where I think that the worst customers for an early stage company are freemium customers, or free plan customers, I should say, because, they're often customers that they have no willingness to pay, and they'll still give you just as much feedback, and they'll still have that wonderful imperfection that early customers have, where they'll because the nice part with early subs is people self-select, for wanting to try a new product, and so as a result, I think those people are very opinionated, and it's great, and they're fantastic customers because they'll actually give you their feedback. But the downside, I think, as a founder is you're always drowning under a volume of feedback, or you should be drowning under a volume of feedback. And it's very hard to, I think, filter that through sometimes when you just have this huge volume without really having a way to be able to, or I guess a framework to be able to work out, well, whose feedback is actually most valuable. And I'm easily the most valuable feedback is always the people that pay you. Because, and the people that pay you more should probably get listened to more, and people that pay you less can be listened to a little bit less. But I think, it's very easy to sort of generate that distraction. And additionally, it's very easy to generate, it's very hard, I guess, to go, it's very hard to price premium right. Evernote, I think, is probably the quintessential example here of they never, I think, quite got it right in terms of that balance between how do you make a product that is free, still usable enough, but is still feature limited enough to justify that actual payment piece.
Yeah.
And it's very, very hard. It's a very hard balance to draw, I think, without a lot of data, without being able to go, okay, well, this is the point that we see customers hit the most value. And, even, I was talking to take a very simple example, talking to the owner of the gym that I go to, and they're thinking about making some pricing changes to introduce kind of like a 3-day membership, rather than unlimited membership. They're going to have you can go 3 times a week or whatever. And I was like, well, that works if the average number of times someone goes is 4.5 or 5, right? Because then it's okay, you're capturing this new market that you wouldn't otherwise really see of the people that are a bit more price sensitive and they can only come 3 days a week, whatever it is. But if the average turns out to be 3.3, you're just going to cannibalize yourself.
Yep.
And so without really having, I think, that data and that knowledge, it's very hard. It's very easy to sort of convince yourself and go, oh yeah, we're going to have a free plan that'll really do X, Y, Z. But it actually comes with all these other problems that are very, very hard to decide unless you have the data to actually drive those decisions. And it's very hard to get that data purely from starting with a free plan. It's much easier to go from a paid plan to introducing free, because then you can work out, okay, well, how many of my customers might downgrade? How many might be able to still fit within the constraints of this free plan that we've generated, and what revenue are we therefore going to lose, or we should lose, right? Not all will necessarily downgrade, but it's very hard to do that without actually having the data there first. And I think founders often think that they want to go purely for people growth and, in terms of user growth, without really realizing that actually, at least from my view as an investor, I would much rather have the, 100 very, very, very engaged, paying, opportunity to upsell kind of customers. I'd much rather have that than 1,000, random users that log in once every eon, don't necessarily, they're trialing 16 different solutions. They've got 16 different accounts to do the same thing. I want to see those people where it's we found this community of people that are just desperate for the problem and they'll pay for it. And paying for stuff is I don't know, I come from B2B. So I'm most businesses can afford money. As a founder, you're really cheap, right? Because you have no budget, right? In the early days. But you're not a sort of normal business, and certainly I'm not saying everyone has enterprise budgets, but even look at Xero, I guess people pay for accounting software. There are lots of things people pay for email, people pay for all these sort of things, and I think often founders don't seem to realize that $10 or $20 a month to a lot of non. I'm sort of going beyond, I guess, micro businesses, where there's maybe 5 or 6 people in them, or 1, I guess. But beyond that, if you can generate good value for them, they'll pay $30 a month, no worries. No drama, Xero is probably still underpriced in some ways. It covers your whole payroll, and the amount of work that used to be involved in having to do payroll and working out all the tax obligations and all kind of stuff. And if you've ever used some of their competitors, I won't name them. If you ever use some of their competitors, they're awful, but you used to pay more for the competitors. You'd buy the box software for $600 or whatever it was, and you think now it's crazy that you would ever do that, but that was the reality. And so I think it's you need to be able to actually sort of focus those things down and be well, what really are we doing here? And I think almost always there should be that market, particularly in B2B. I'm so not nearly as savvy in terms of consumer markets. But particularly in B2B, like there should always be that market where they're like, they'd happily pay double or triple or 4 times, because they're very happy with it. I remember sending some of our biggest enterprise customers, sending our first invoice to them for like £10,000. And you're like, and we got an email back one day being like, is this monthly or annual? And I was like, oh shit, it's annual. But like they couldn't have cared. If we'd said it was monthly, they probably would have still paid it.
Yeah.
And I think you really need to be able to try and find those kinds of markets and those kinds of spaces, because that I think is where you'll be able to find the most leverage as an early company. That's where people are happy with those tools that are less polished and less beautiful and might occasionally, God forbid, have bugs in them. Software never has bugs, right? But they're the spaces where I think you really can. And pricing is often a lever to be able to both self-select customers in. So, if someone's not willing to pay $5 a month, I'm like, they're not probably going to be a customer that I ever want to deal with. And, vice versa, if you're, let's say that you're selling, I don't know, some big fancy ERP system that's, runs your 15,000 person organization's, HR systems. If you're pricing that at $100 a month, they'd be like, what the hell's wrong with this? So the price can also have a signal that it's too low, and free has that problem too. But the price can also signal too low as much as it can signal too high. And I think founders too heavily focus on price always being perceived by people as too high, because some people should always say this is too expensive.
Yeah.
And if there isn't people saying it's too expensive, you've got to just like bring the price up.
I have a great image that I found on socials the other day, which is a $500 client with the message saying, have you seen this? I'm trusting you with my life. I hope, you better bring me some return on this investment. And the $50,000 client saying money's been sent. Thanks. Yep. And I think it's so accurate. I first read it in the Tim Ferriss book as well, in terms of, selecting the type of customers that you want, because it's just the way that, psychology, and I guess works is people kind of self-select, and unfortunately the customers that, pay you less are generally going to be more demanding than the customers that have a high threshold.
They can be very tricky to deal with. And like, again, like, I think one of the realities of us is, we aim to be an advanced tool. We aim to offer advanced features. We aim to offer features for the person for whom, Instagram is their main, social channel and all kind of stuff. But as a result, like, we have, there is complexity in the UX. We've got lots of options, got lots of features. Like, understanding the best way to use it. There's about 16 different ways you can upload a post, which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? The good thing is, you can do it in a way that's going to be perfect for your particular use case and your style of working and the way that you want to be able to do things. The downside is when you first learn it, it's really complicated, right? And so for us, it's like, if you are someone who is able to, or who is willing, I guess, I'll use the word willing, to sit down and actually learn the interface, you'll do fantastic. And if you're someone who thinks that it should just you should just pick it up in organically, you're probably going to end up suiting, a different company that offers much, much simpler features, like a whole lot less features, probably a lower price, not always, but probably a lower price, and that's probably where your use case sits. And that's fine. Like, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being like, look, like, there are going to be some customers that aren't going to suit us, and we're not seeking to be everything to everyone. But I think that's the sort of balance you have to end up having to draw out, unless you're actually also capturing more economic revenue out of that, you're just going to end up shooting yourself in the foot, and that's, again, I'm not someone that builds the email tool for the masses, whether it's B2B or B2C. I'm much more a sort of, niche SaaS type world person, but, that sort of is fairly consistently been my experience across the companies I've worked with as well.
So Hugh, you mentioned, it's, once you have that data in place, it can be a lot easier to understand how to structure your pricing or just to make better decisions with the business overall. For early stage businesses that potentially don't have that data in place, what do you recommend as a starting point, and what are things that you're looking for that founders should be looking for when deciding that actually I need to bump this up, or we've potentially charged too high?
So I think the first pricing you ever do is always just guesswork, right? Probably a bad thing to say, right? I think the first time you build that pricing model and work that out is just, you're just essentially pulling numbers, proverbially out of the proverbial place. And, you're just sort of hoping and sort of seeing how people respond, when you say, oh, it's 10 grand, it's $200, and you sort of see what that balance is. And that's where I guess my rule of thumb is that someone should be saying it's too expensive, right? So if you're hearing none of that, then it's probably way too cheap. But I think ultimately for me, what I sort of want to understand, and I was talking to one of the founders we've been working with just recently about this, what I sort of want to understand is like that you understand the dynamics of the market. So you should understand, if we charge this, then it means that. If we charge that, then it means this. And that's a little bit of sort of, I guess, pricing experimentation, but also I think it's just like talking with your customers and having that real knowledge of them, where, you know, for some customers they go, oh, you know, if it goes from $49 to $55, they're like, oh, you know, over $50, that's quite a lot. You know, whereas other customers, it might be going from, you know, $9,000 to $10,000 or $10,000 to $20,000, whatever it is. But really, I think you need to be able to have that sort of real, true customer understanding to be able to know on a pricing front, like, what do they perceive as cheap? What do they perceive as expensive? How does that differ across your different customer segments and across different, you know, sort of areas that you compete in and the different places that you are? And, you know, where's the competition pricing and things like that? And hopefully there's someone savvy, you know, in the competitive world that maybe someone else has done at least some research on that, right? And so for me, it's actually more about, like, have you really sort of thought through that and have you talked to them about it? You know, because again, like, very, very early stage customers, there's nothing wrong with saying to them, like, hey, how much do you pay for this? How much do you pay for that? Like, what do you reckon that's worth? They won't always be right. Like, you don't have to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to price it whatever you tell me what it is going to be. But I think you need to actually have those conversations and say to them, hey, look, you know, if this looked like, you know, if this was a, you know, like classic is like, oh, you know, you're launching a new feature, you know, do you make that new feature a add-on? You know, should it be an additional cost on the subscription, or should it be included into the thing? And do you grandfather your existing plans on this new, you know, new feature or whatever it is? You know, and then you can actually go to customers as part of that sort of customer development and hopefully the sort of research that you're doing in terms of this new feature and whatever you're launching, and showing them the beta or whatever it is, and say, hey, look, you know, this is going to be, we're thinking this is going to be $25 a month. Would you get it? You know, and if you're talking to 20, 30, 40 customers, you know, you name enough random prices to eventually work out, like, oh, no one's going to pay for this, we should probably just include it in the package. Or, oh yeah, you know, people will pay somewhere between sort of 15 and $25, so let's charge it at 20. You know, so I think you sort of work out by that sort of piece of, you know, sort of interviewing and research to be able to sort of do that. And so what I want to see in founders is sort of that they've actually thought about that. So it's not just sort of like pricing as this random thing. You always start somewhere randomly. But beyond that is that they're always thinking about, like, am I capturing the right amount of value? Am I sort of at that right point on that sort of, you know, price quantity chart, not to get into too much of like economics, but am I at that right point of that price quantity chart of being able to go, well, at this point people will start, you know, falling off because it's way too expensive, or too many people will start falling off because it's way too expensive. But at this point we'll actually either lose customers because it's too cheap and it's perceived to be too cheap, or alternatively, you know, we'll be leaving too much money on the table because we're going to be sending invoices to, you know, companies that pay bajillions of dollars a year for something. For most things, we're going to be sending them invoices for $50. Because, you know, again, one of those weird operational complexities you learn is, like, enterprises like to pay for things by invoice. And that process is, even if you say you have 14-day terms, that process generally takes 45 to 60 because you've got to, like, find the AP department, you've got to get the PO number raised, you've got to get the purchase order approved, and then you've got to put the purchase order on the invoice, and you've got to follow up the payment, and then they're going to ask you, oh, you know, can I pay by check? And you're going to be like, no, I'm not an American company, don't send me a bloody check. And they're going to send it to you anyway, and then it's going to get sent from the US back to Australia, and it's like, you know, like there's this whole mess that happens that I think happens, and people are like, oh, you know, can I just pay by bank transfer every month? And I'm like, no, you know, we don't do that, because it's just, you know, again, it's like in the early days you might say, yeah, you know, that's fine, I want to take any money I can get. But in reality, it's like, you know, you need to accept that, you know, for us, for example, we're like, okay, we only offer, you know, invoice type terms on these certain plans paid annually. We don't offer it otherwise. You know, we will not accept a bank transfer or a US check. We don't accept US checks, but they send them anyway. But, you know, we don't do that. And the funny thing is, and what I kind of realized was that when you start saying that, they just go, oh, okay, cool. Then just sign me up to the annual plan. Or like, they'll go, oh, so I either pay like $25 by credit card, or I pay like $2,000 via invoice. Cool, the company will just pay the $2,000 invoice. You're like, oh, cool. Like, there you go. You just 4x revenue from that customer. Yeah. And admittedly, like, it's still going to be a pain because you still have to do all those steps, right? So it's not like it's like you're just sort of giving up the, you know, the $750 or whatever. It still is actually a lot of work. But I think that's where it's like you want to be able to understand those pricing dynamics across your different customer segments to be able to really understand where should pricing sit. And you never get it perfect, but hopefully it should be, you know, sufficiently right. You know, are you wanting to be the cutthroat competitor, or are you wanting to be the premium offering? Where do you want to sit in that spectrum? You know, getting these dials that you can, you know, fiddle with.
Yeah. I remember Jason Lemkin from SaaStr wrote a tweet about this, I think it's probably a couple of months ago, talking about how he's seen so many successful businesses launching that have very similar products, just launching to different customer segments based on pricing.
100%.
And it's like, it's just a completely underrated aspect of launching startups. I'm just really curious from a investment perspective, because, you know, I think it's a really good signal for founder understanding their market, of knowing, you know, yes, there are competitors in the space. Not only do we kind of compete on product, but actually they're going after this specific customer segment. We think that there's a gap here because of this, and as a result, we're charging X. Are those things that you're looking for from an angel investment perspective or a Galileo perspective? What level of detail or insight that gets you excited?
So I really want that deep customer insight. That's what I really, really want. And I was talking to a founder, a non-Galileo, portfolio founder, but a founder that I know through the Startup Victoria Growth Club. It pitched a startup. Here's a little, ad for Startup Victoria. They've got
Love
a new
Startup
thing.
Vic.
Yeah, Growth Club. It's great. So I'm a proud Growth Club member, but it's for scale-ups in Victoria. But we're talking to him about it, and I think one of his challenges was, he competes with SAP Workday and Oracle's ERP and all that sort of stuff. And people go, oh, how do you compete with them in enterprise? Because obviously Oracle, SAP, they're good at selling enterprise stuff, no matter how crap it is. And on the other side, he's got cheap competitors in sort of the SME type space as well. And Excel is one of them, or Excel is almost always a competitor in B2B SaaS. And I was like, well, but the story that you want to tell to an investor, we're talking about this fundraise. I was like, the story you want to tell to an investor is actually, hey, here's this Oracle tool, here's this SAP tool, all this sort of stuff. But we have customers that use and pay for these tools. They pay a whole lot of money for these tools, but they still don't deliver their needs. So they pay us as well. And that's actually the story you want to illustrate, right? Is you want to show, oh, well, yeah, okay, we've got competitors. We have these big enterprise competitors, but you know what? They're actually so missing in features that even though you're paying hundreds of $1,000s a year for a license, these customers are they're still oh yeah, here's some more money to someone else. And I think that's really, for me, that's where I want to be able to see that customer insight of saying, well, when I talk to this person, I deep dove with this person being why can't you use competitor tool Y for this that you already have and you already use? And they told me X, Y, Z. My favorite way of answering any question about customers is when someone replies and says, oh, well, when I was talking to Sue from blah, blah, blah last week, she said. And I think it's that's really where you want to get to that point of that sort of customer knowledge and that product knowledge where it's you really want to be able to go have that sort of insight piece of being able to just sort of immediately dial up that interview in your mind and be oh, customer X said this. That's why I've made this decision. And yeah, there's that thing of, how do you generalize it sufficiently across enough people? And that's where it's you can't just do 2 interviews and say that you're done. But ideally for me, I want to be able to see enough insight that it's oh, when I spoke to this person, they said this. When I spoke to that person, they said this. Here's the 4 or 5 answers that I usually get for that question. That's the sort of level of insight that I really appreciate and I really want to sort of see in founders. And that doesn't always have to be, I think in some ways, part of our thesis as a fund is that doesn't have to be from industry experience. It's not because you've done a fintech company because you were a banker for 25 years. You can actually generate insight outside of that. And sometimes I would say, I'd say a lot of the time, that unique insight that drives a new business actually comes from someone that is looking at it from outside. And that's, like I said, it's part of our thesis. But, I think that's where, some people do say that insight should or could or whatever can come from obviously industry experience, but often an industry experienced founder has only worked at 1 or 2 companies in the space. They haven't worked at 10, but an industry inexperienced founder has talked to 50 people. They talked to 60 people across, all the major, tier 1 businesses in that space. They've talked to all the tier 2 people. They've talked to people that have worked there for 5 years and then left, and they've talked to people, they've covered all those different dots. And I think you get a very different cross section of views compared to perhaps the way that one specific big enterprise does it or one specific department does it or whatever it is. So that's where I guess, part of our, we're very bullish on those types of founders where it's they're coming new to a space because of that exact reason.
Yeah. One of the other people that I spoke to in preparing for this interview was James, who is your co-founder with Galileo as well. And, obviously he kind of walked me through the really fascinating story in terms of how you guys and Galileo came together. If I have the timeline correct, you guys met on a yacht in Europe?
We did. I'm pleased. I'm very delighted that he told you that because that's the unofficial answer to that question of how we met, but yes. Yeah,
well, he did tell me that there are 2 stories. You met on a yacht, came back, and I think you guys had coffee in Sydney and kind of started chatting. That was back in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, I think, was it 2015 or before that? Strangely, James is actually friends with my sister's group of friends. So it was actually that we sort of always had this strange crossover of spaces. So I've sort of probably known him for even probably longer than that, but it's probably the first time I had spent a lot of time with him. And yeah, it probably was 15, 16 when we first started talking about Galileo and then what became Galileo right back in the day.
Yeah. I'm really curious in terms of how that sort of thesis first came together as well, because I think James mentioned that, it was quite a lengthy process for both of you in terms of deciding, kind of saying that you wanted to do something in the space, but just making sure that you were both aligned. And I think it's the first time that you've had a kind of a co-founder as well.
First time I had a co-founder. Yeah, I know exactly. Never be a solo founder. It's awful. I can tell you now, even having gone through the ringer and come out the other side, it's awful being a solo founder. So, and I guess probably I shouldn't say that too strongly, but I would say that the journey is significantly harder as a solo founder, and even I think once you get quite relatively mature and you start hiring very senior people and, you have senior people on your teams, it's very, very different having a co-founder in terms of the reliability and the conversations you can have and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very different. Actually, somewhat jokingly, as a quick solo co-founder side story there was like, I had a week off a little while ago from Galileo stuff. And at one point, James, and I sort of said, James, the point of having a co-founder is I can take a week off, decide, and go away. And it was actually like, it was like, I said it as a bit of a joke, but also it was actually quite refreshing being able to be like, no, I'm actually on holidays, like go away. That you don't actually really get as a solo founder. But yeah, like we spoke about it for a very long time. So James ran Incubate, started Incubate, ran Incubate, which was the University of Sydney's startup accelerator. So if you're from Melbourne, it's equivalent of MAP. From Queensland, there's obviously equivalents in each state and territory, or each university really these days. So he ran that for a very long time, and he was running that while we were working, when we first met. And I sort of had seen it as an angel investor the other side of that as well, of where, you had all of these sort of explosion of university accelerator incubator. I kind of see the terms as equivalent, but early stage startup programs had this big explosion of them. And, what does that mean? And, had all these sort of new startups sort of graduating out of these programs. And then kind of they're sort of, they're very structured programs. They're very organized. They usually run over 6 months or 3 months or 12 weeks, 14 weeks. And then they just kind of disappear into the ether. And they sort of go, particularly I think for a very sort of the younger demographic, very early stage founder, perhaps undergraduate type experienced founder, they're used to a program of lectures, tutorials, and startup program that's been similarly quite structured of lectures, tutorials, that kind of stuff. And they just kind of disappear off into the community. And we do a very bad job, I think, in the startup community of actually delivering structured approaches to things. And particularly for that earlier stage where, there's lots of events for early stage founders, but there's not a lot that sort of is like structured. And so what I sort of saw was like, yes, you might occasionally see, obviously that end up, raising money from angels or, friends, family and fools. And, what you'd often see is, there might occasionally even be a, big institutional VC that might write a small angel-sized check, but, just couldn't provide any support. And so you sort of go from this like, 100 to 0 type deceleration of the support and structure that was provided to them. And so James and I talked about it for a very long time because it was like, I sort of saw from the operating and operational side, well, a lot of the stuff that I was dealing with the sort of companies I was investing as an angel, like I guess again, somewhat jokingly, but it's also a little bit of truth in there. As an angel, I was like, look, like I'm kind of buying a consulting project, and not because I got paid, but like as in I would invest and then end up as a sort of like quasi consultant, where it was like, oh, how do we set up our customer support processes? And so you'd spend a few days with the founder being like, here, like, let's talk through the problems, let's set it all up, like, let's work all these things out. And, I'm not a believer in advisor equity and things like that. Like I was always hey, I invest, and then if you want my help, happy to do it. I've got time and I can give you a day or two of my time or whatever it is. But like what I felt was lacking, and what we both saw was lacking, was like a sort of a VC, an institutional VC, I should say, an institutional VC in Australia that actually took that approach, and took that approach over not just like a 10-week or a 12-week period, but actually said like, hey, like, we want to write decent sized checks. We want to give you proper runway. We want to see you have proper runway. And then we actually want to like structurally support you in a very organized way to make sure that kind of we're going to sort of carry you from that sort of, early stage founder program or early stage business through to your sort of Series A type size company or type size raise. And so that was kind of where we talked about it for a very long time. We talked about all the challenges of that, talked about how we saw, I guess, the broader investing ecosystem and the way that they approach particularly first-time founders, early career founders, if you use the early career researcher joke. Early career founders, rather than sort of, fourth or fifth or sixth-time founder or, second or third-time founder, we sort of saw these sort of things that both of us found very frustrating and sort of saw that there was a bit of a gap in the market. And so then eventually we said, let's go and do it. We thought it was a really great time to raise a VC fund. We went out to start raising. Probably took us 2.5 years. Never raised a VC fund. Another awful experience you never want to have to go through. But we learned a lot of new things. It was definitely a unique experience, a very different experience, and very challenging. I guess trying to persuade, and that thesis develops over time. The same way that as a startup, your pitch develops over time. And it was very interesting, sort of going to the usual the usual and perhaps sometimes the unusual people saying, hey, can you give us a cut of your cash? And it's quite hard to get people to part with money. Like, that's a good thing and a bad thing. But we eventually managed to get there. And so we launched the fund in September last year. And now we're actively investing. So we write checks at any point. We like to think of ourselves as a friendly seed VC, and very much seed with a capital S. So we sort of want to, James and I are kind of still working on exactly what we call our mission, but in a sense, what we really want to see is like we want to have conversations with every founder that's raising anywhere between 150 and 500K. So, I think if we've been successful, then we will have a conversation with every founder in Australia and probably New Zealand, and we've even started going to Asia, that raises any round between 150 and 500K. We write 200 grand checks roughly, got some flexibility on that depending on various bits and pieces. But we sort of don't have standard terms. We have sort of a standard term that's for companies that we see typically, but we're able to have flexibility as necessary for our investors, and for our for the round size, I guess, 500K rounds very different to a 200K round. And so really for us it's about we want to be able to talk to those founders at that point and work out like is there the right fit. One of the challenges I think as a VC is like you learn very quickly that portfolio construction and sort of does this meet thesis is very important, because we can meet a great company and it's well outside thesis and be like, look, it's just outside thesis. And then we either need to go to our investors and say, hey, look, we're doing this deal, but it's way outside thesis. Or go, look, we're going to have to pass. It's not on the thesis of the fund, because ultimately our investors have trusted us with their cash to execute the thesis, and that will hopefully work. If not, then we haven't done a particularly great job, or the thesis is wrong. You don't know if the thesis is wrong. Sometimes it is. But, you sort of end up with these, again, constraints you have to operate within as a VC fund that I think a lot of founders don't always necessarily understand. I don't think I necessarily understood them before I really got deeply into VC. It's certainly been a bit of an interesting learning curve, even just on the operational and compliance front. But, that's just, oddly enough, not everyone talks about VC compliance. It's not a particularly sexy area of the law or the tax law, let alone. But I think it's a very interesting space. And it is really challenging to have to think about that like portfolio theory in the way that you don't really have to as an angel. You can kind of talk about it in theory of saying, oh, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I'm less interested in. But I think as a VC, it's a bit different because we're one of the downsides of kind of not being an angel syndicate or whatever it is that no, actually, we have an actual mandate. We have to follow the mandate. Like we have a regulator. We have to write compliance reporting to our regulator. We have, financial services licensing and all these other things that like you just don't have to deal with as an angel. An angel syndicate is somewhere in between, right? Where they're not quite as high compliance as a VC fund, but they're not as low compliance as an angel, obviously. Writing, I just used to write investment stuff on my balance sheet, essentially. And so, you used to sort of go through this whole process. And it has, I think, been a really interesting journey as a result. And, then there's sort of that whole back office piece. And there's also then the front end of like having to then talk to founders and explain what it is you're doing and, where they might fit, where they don't fit. And I think one of the most challenging conversations I find myself having with founders all the time is like the question of venture scale. And I think we do a very bad job in Australia of really unpacking like what is a VC funded company, and what is not a VC funded company. And if it's not VC fundable, that's fine. Like can still be a fantastic business to run. It's a great outcome. Like, most businesses aren't VC funded, and that's fine. And in some ways, like as a founder, like going and chasing VC money or chasing angel money, any sort of investment, that's going to kill the company more than it's going to save it. But you do definitely meet, not infrequently, I will say, you definitely do meet people that just have convinced themselves that like that's the only sign of success.
Yep.
And I've always been like, funded or not, the best sign of success is people paying you for stuff, right? The best investor money is from customers paying for a product. Whether you're VC funded or not, like, no VC is going to complain about good cash flow. But I think that's where, I think we find we have a lot of hard conversations with founders sometimes about being like, does this really actually, because you can always do some sort of weird top-down or bottom-up model to try and convince yourself that you're in a multi-billion-dollar market. But like, is that really the business?
Yeah, like, and I'm wondering, especially in your case, because, as a solo bootstrapped founder who's now got his own fund and writing checks, investing into venture scalable businesses. I guess, how do you sort of balance that, or how do you sort of, are they easy conversations for you? Is it easier for you to identify what is and isn't venture?
Oh, I don't think anyone knows. I don't think anyone knows directly what is and isn't. Like I said, if I knew exactly how to pick every winner that the ecosystem was going to generate, I'd hopefully have a much bigger fund than I had now. No, I mean, I think it's. I guess for me, it's like I've seen both sides. So for me, I think there's. Usually it's like, most of the time, to be fair, it's like, it's less that there's necessarily, you're either one or the other. It's the ones where you're uncertain. Some businesses you meet, you're like, you are going to be very capital intensive for a while. maybe there's a lot of IP they've got to generate, or maybe it's just a very, it's a nascent category they've got to create, whatever it is that they've got to really actually do and attract, or, to actually get to scale, they're going to need hundreds of people or whatever it is. There are categories like that where you're like, look, you're going to have to be VC funded, you're just not going to work. And then there are also things where it's like, look, like this is a like super niche SaaS thing that I think will, carry a headcount of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people, but probably isn't going to get to 300 over a 3 or 4 year period. And that's fine. And then you can have a conversation about what that means. The tricky thing, I think, is where it's like there's some space in between the two where it's like, well, should this, is this really a VC looking thing? Is this not a VC looking thing? What's the balance there? And part of, I think, the decision that has to go on is like, as a founder, what kind of business do you want to run? And I am a big fan of saying like there are two paths, there's no middle ground. And as a founder, you kind of have to choose one of the paths, and you sort of want to actively, particularly if you have both as an option. Options are good and bad things, right? Good part is you've got options, bad thing is you've got to choose. And so for me, it's like I think you want to have a lot of clarity across the co-founding team of like, what kind of business do we want to run? Do we want to run, ultimately in VC, you are a growth at all costs, business. And that's what we do. We're growth at almost all costs, because that's generally how, the economics of every VC fund the world over is, hey, you've got to find the home runs and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure that there's some information about that, but I think, again, not a lot of founders necessarily know it, but you have to sort of be gunning for those home runs. And the reality of that is like, as a result, like you've got to really, really focus on growth. And that's fine, that's one model, and that's one way of thinking about things. And as a co-founder, as a founder, you want to be actually very bought in on that. You want to believe that, hey, look, this is the kind of business I want to run. Because it means certain things. Like it means you're going to spend a lot of your time hiring. If you hate hiring, like I don't know if you should be running a VC funded, like a VC, high growth, high scale company, because you are going to spend a lot of your time in hiring. Yeah. Same thing with sales. Like hiring and sales is like almost all of your job in a very high growth business as a founder. Almost all of it, particularly as the sort of the CEO type founder. So much of your job is just hiring and sales. And I think that's often forgotten, is that that's really the path. And so for people that are, I guess, in some ways, very purist product minded founders, it can be very hard to actually have them shift into that mindset. And it can be quite uncomfortable for everyone involved. And so I think it's like, you want to be able to draw that balance. So it's been interesting having to shift into that. As an angel, it was very easy to sort of go, well, hey, look, worst case, this thing pays you back in dividends and I'm okay with that. And, that's, I think, a very different, again, different fiduciary responsibility. I don't necessarily rely on that as a VC fund. I can't rely on that as a VC fund. And so, it is a very different experience in that sense. But I think, one of the things that I guess I'm lucky about is being able to say, well, look, like, I've seen the inside of VC funded companies. I've spent time, working with and in them. Obviously both as an investor and as a team member and all that kind of stuff. Run a bootstrap company. A lot of friends that run bootstrap companies. Seen the ups and downs of that. Had the whole gamut experience as a founder. And some things are very consistent. Everyone has people problems. People is always the biggest challenge in every business. But then other things are very, very different. Like I said, things like the approach to growth is very, very different between the two groups. And you can try and, turn a square into put a square peg into a round hole, but it's just makes this founding journey even harder. Feels worse.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's always great to have options. And, I think traditionally in Australia anyways, like I think the narrative is you have to go and raise funding, or that is kind of seen as the default. And then you've got another group, I've had DHH on the podcast before, who has, very particular views about bootstrapping and what it means to take on venture funding. For founders who are stuck in the middle, again, I spoke to Lachlan Donald from BuildKite, incredible story of bootstrapping for the most part, and then recently, deciding to take on some external capital. For any founders that are in that in-between zone, do you have advice on how they should think about approaching it? Or like, what would your broad strokes approach be or advice be, knowing that, it's different in all cases?
It is. I mean, it is very different in all cases. I think the big thing for me is really to say, like, what type of business do you want to run? They are different kinds of businesses to run, ultimately. As founder-friendly as most VCs would love to call themselves, I include myself in that group of VCs that want to call themselves founder-friendly. Ultimately, you are essentially a marketplace, between your investors on one side and the expected fiduciary returns, and startups on the other, where, obviously everything goes well, everything aligns, everyone wins, yay, it's a win-win outcome. But the reality is, not everything always aligns. And not everything always aligns at all the right times. And I think, I've had some interesting experiences with, early stage founders, both bootstrapped and not, is like, you can sometimes meet early stage founders that are thinking of doing some sort of M&A, some sort of exit. And as a bootstrap founder, often what's quite interesting is a lot of the time their expectations at exit are very different to a VC funded company. And part of that's driven because ultimately the investors are going to be sitting there going like, hey, like, we've got to make sure we get a return here, right? But the other part of that is like, as a bootstrap founder, you have a very different, or you don't always, I should say, but often you find that they have a very different approach to what that actually means. And that can often mean that they end up, if they go through that exit path, they're going to be leaving a whole lot of money on the table. That, instead, what we're seeing increasingly often in the bootstrap world in particular is like these sort of big rounds where a substantive amount is secondary to the founders. And so, let's say, you're going to hypothetically do like $20 million round, right? Intentionally choose big numbers. Let's say you're hypothetically doing a $20 million round as a bootstrap founder, and rather than just having 20 go straight to the company, you're going to put, like 10 towards each co-founder, 10 towards the co-founders, 5 each or whatever, and then 10 into the company. And so the alternative might have been to have exited for 10 million. And instead, you can actually sort of run this dual track process of going, well, if we are looking at some sort of exit or M&A type path, maybe there's actually instead a place where we can go, let's actually just take investor cash and secondary if you're not done with the business. Let's take investor cash and secondary and sort of you see, it's been a thing in the US for a very long time, but you sort of see certainly Series B, Series C, and increasingly Series A, you start seeing more and more secondary occurring in the Australian market. Not so much at seed, it's a bit too early, but you certainly see it, Series A, Series B, Series C, some secondary occurring to allow the founders to cash out some of that growth along the way and de-risk themselves, or however you want to think about it, pay off credit cards, pay off mortgages. You do see that happening, and I think that's a positive sign, and gives them an opportunity to be able to access that. And we've seen some very, very good stories. Like Atlassian obviously is the poster child of the bootstrapping journey of having a massive, Accel Series A and then pretty much going straight to IPO. Almost that. I think it's very impressive that we do see founders and we can see founders doing that. And sadly, though, unfortunately, I think it is often the exception to the rule in those bootstrapping world. I know a lot more bootstrap founders that are sort of like, not stuck. Stuck's probably the wrong word, but like, they get beyond that initial scale of like, so again, in SaaS you talk about like 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, right? And I know tons and tons of founders that have ended up running, bootstrap SaaS companies that just sort of get stuck in that sort of valley of death between 1 and 10. When in the sort of VC world is like you want to sort of go from 1 to 10 over a period of like 18 months, 2 years, ideally, I should say. But, like that should be that, if you're assuming you're tripling growth year on year, you shouldn't end up getting stuck between 1 and 10 for that long. Whereas it can be very, very hard as a bootstrap founder to actually sustain that type of growth in SaaS where, often your revenues are, later tailed in terms of time. It can be much harder to actually then front run enough, growth and marketing money to be able to then experience that growth and get through that and push through that phase. And so, like, I know lots and lots of people that end up getting stuck there. And maybe it's self-selecting, because they keep running businesses. Whereas in VC, if get to $2 million in revenue and then you fall over, the sort of growth stops, then usually you'll shut down, whatever, exit. So maybe there is a bit of self-selection going on there, but I think it's definitely a very tricky balance. And again, like, so for me, it comes back to like, what sort of business do you want to run as a founder? Like, how are you going to run that? What does that sort of approach look like? I've got friends that are like, look, like, I'm gunning for the sort of company that in 5 years we're going to sell for 85 million. That's going to mean that my dilution is going to look like this. I should then be able to get, X, Y, Z. And that's what I want to be able to retire. And you're like, cool. And then they've got a very, very, it's not going to happen that way, but they've got a very clear idea in their mind as to what sort of company they want to run, what that means. They've sort of essentially like back engineered the whole thing. And I think that's, again, has its upsides and downsides, but the nice part is it gives them clarity about like, well, this is why I have to invest now. This is why I have to raise now. This is the terms I need to be able to actually then get to that outcome that I want. And I think that's where, sometimes it can be very challenging, particularly for bootstrap founders, because they often, typically speaking, have less support. And they have fewer people who have that knowledge around them to be able to say, hey, look, this is kind of what you should be expecting. This is the growth rate you should expect, or this is how much you should think about, reinvesting in growth compared to taking it out as profit or whatever it is. All those kinds of conversations I think are, much easier had in venture because hopefully your venture capitalist can have that insight and have that knowledge and, sort of push you to have those conversations early on. That, certainly for me as a solo founder, like never had that conversation with anyone. And that was very much, I'd say, to my detriment. I made a lot of mistakes over the way. And, I think while yes, we're seeing, more and more people who are able to support those types of founders, it still is a very, very different journey.
Speaking of getting stuck, you kind of briefly touched on this in terms of the 2.5 year process in terms of raising the fund for Galileo as well. And I think it's often not something that a lot of founders necessarily understand, the process that goes into raising a fund as well. And James kind of shared some stories as well in terms of, like, I guess one particular instance. I'm not sure if you want to talk about it on the podcast, but a particular investor that you thought would go in that you had your hopes on that didn't actually go through. And there's the same process that founders have to go through in terms of raising funds is very similar in terms of the process that you have to go through in terms of putting your first fund together. Do you mind sharing, what were some of the lessons that you picked up of going through that process, just to give founders who are listening to the show some insight into what that entails?
Yeah, I mean, it is, in a sense, it is very similar to pitching a startup, right? You're pitching a company, you're saying, hey, look, I think I'm going to generate returns, like, this is what we think, this is the market, this is, and for us, that's the thesis, and, the growth in, various things. And, we had all those things to point out. And, we initially went out and sort of thought, oh, well, we're going to unlock this amazing new investor pool, times of low interest rates and all that kind of stuff. Surely people are going to be looking for alternatives. We're starting to see more and more, cashed out founders. Let's try and tap these sort of hidden, unknown investor pools and all that kind of stuff. And I would say for a very long time, we sort of chased that tree. And then, what I think we learned over time, and again, I'm sort of like, there's this thing of part one is you learn to sell stuff, right? And then you learn to pitching a company is a subset of selling stuff, and pitching a fund is also a part of just selling stuff. And one of the key things about selling stuff is you've got to be able to qualify the lead, right? And you don't always know at the start how you qualify a lead, because you've sort of not done it enough to be got enough yeses to be able to work out, okay, well, what are the attributes of the people that say yes that I can then work out to be the qualifying piece of maybe it's budget or whatever it is, And so I think over time we sort of got slowly better at qualifying leads, so to say. And a big part of that, I think, was, for example, one of the biggest determinants, some of our checks were the kind of checks where it's you'd chat with someone and be like, yeah, I'm in for X $1,000. And you're like, oh, cool, wow. And that's it. And you had other ones where there was 6 meetings and and it's exactly the same as every sales cycle you do, right? It's as you do more and more meetings, you realize that the likelihood of the deal closing is lower and lower and lower. And we discovered that actually a lot of the time, that the investors that were easiest to get on board were people that had previously done venture investment. It wasn't just they'd previously invested in startups, but they'd previously invested in venture funds, which was almost the opposite of what we were hoping, right? We were surely anyone that's invested in venture funds will be tapped out. They've already got allocation. Why would they want more? But I think it's a certain kind of person, because what I guess we learned over time was there is a lot of interest from the community as a whole, in this idea of startup investing. But a lot of people want to pick, right? They want to be the stock pickers. They want to choose the startups. They want to have that sort of active role and have that sort of, I'll use the word play, but it's not really in the sense of pure play. I mean, the same way that investing isn't purely gambling, but it has sort of similar attributes and crossover sometimes. And I think what I guess we learned is there is a lot of conversation. We see this a lot in sort of the government policy and things like that, talking about how do we increase early stage investment and all kind of stuff. And I think what can be very challenging is that we have a lot of angel investors in Australia that almost like the process of investing more than the reality. And the reality is that really a lot of the time, you shouldn't be, rolling your sleeves up, in the trenches with the startup the whole time, because eventually they've got to actually stand on their own 2 feet. And you actually need to have that sort of quite active thing of being look, these are the boundaries I have to draw. And you also don't have, perfect knowledge of the business because you're not inside the tent. I think we learned a lot over time about who are those types of people that would typically end up being investors. How much of them were people that believed in, some of our investors saw it purely as from financial returns. Fantastic. I'm very happy to talk about financial return side. Other ones, almost sort of philanthropic. We're out there to go and, support early stage founders, particularly younger early stage founders, first time founders, first high growth business, all that kind of stuff. And some of them were look, I love the mission. I don't really care whether it makes a truckload of money. And I'm great, we will make you a truckload of money and you can give it straight back to me for the next fund when we do give you a whole lot of money. But for some of them, that was the motivating factor. So it was really I think we learned over time about how do you kind of explore and discover those things that motivate the person, and then I guess pitch the sale right, so to say. Pitch the sale right to be well, this is how that aligns with what you're looking for, or this is how it doesn't align with that. And then sort of being able to work out those pieces of just, like signals of people that, we generally had people, we spoke to people that said, oh yeah, I just don't believe that, that 20-something-year-old founders can create good businesses. And you're when did you start your first business? And they're like, oh, I was 26. And you're like, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? But it was really actually very, very fascinating seeing some of the people that are very much, even some of the people that people know quite well in the space, who really genuinely like don't believe that early stage founders and younger founders and first time founders actually create good companies. It was occasionally quite shocking. Even when they themselves were first time founder that created a huge family business or, huge, trade sale or whatever it was that, has meant that happened. It was very, very surprising to see that. And again, it's about really how does that align, and how does that align with the way that they want to run their life and their finances. And, ultimately you're asking people's money, and that's, it comes with fiduciary duty, The most challenging part I would say about, coming back to the question of how is it different to pitching a startup, I think the most challenging part is with a startup, you sort of know what you're getting to some degree. They pivot over time and things change and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of the time you sort of know what you're getting. And the hardest part with the VC fund is you pitch the thesis. You say, hey, look, this is the type of companies we're looking for. These are the types of companies that, that meet that thesis now. Like, this is what it might look like. But then they say like, oh, so what's it going to invest in? And you're like, I don't know. We'll see what meets the thesis and at the right stage when we launch the fund. You can't, in private equity, for example, the way it usually works, as I learned through this whole process, the way it usually works in private equity is actually you do the fund's first deal. So you line up the first deal, you line up all the financing, you usually line up the first investor, the friendly investor, to actually finance the whole first deal. And you essentially close the first deal of the private equity fund before you go and raise the fund. Because then you can say to them, hey, look, this is the thesis. We've found the first company. Here's the target. Here's all its financials. Here's all the, and this is already done. It's already in there. It's already there. It's already there. There's no questions. If you want to ask me about, what's the EBITDA multiple or whatever it is on that particular thing, or how we're going to actually do improve the ROIC on the company, whatever it is, you can have all those, conversations. Whereas in VC, because of some of the structural sides of it, you can talk about, angel portfolios and bits and pieces like that. But you can't actually have that same approach to it. So it is a little bit different, I think, in that sense. But that was, I guess the second part that was a bit more challenging. So we are technically still fundraising. So, there's a good pitch. If you're a Section 708 investor, please hit me up. But, we are still, I guess fundraising because we haven't finished our second close. But that was, I think, the big thing that we learned over time was that, you did have to be able to work out what was that pitch, how did that fit in with the investor, what were the qualifying criteria, what did that mean, and what did that mean for check size, what time would you push someone to increase check size? When wouldn't you increase check size? How do you explain the way that, let's say you invest, I don't know, 900K, hypothetically, happens to me all the time. With VC funds, that capital's called over time. So, they typically have a 3 to 4 year investment period. So it's not like you just sort of on day zero, you give them 300K or 900K and you walk off. Instead, it's they'll have a, I guess a schedule, a planned calendar, I guess, of when they're going to actually call your capital. So instead of being 900K, you're actually investing 300 over 3 years, or ends up being over 4 years and it's 250 or whatever it is. I can't do the math that well in my head. And so you sort of end up spending a lot of time with people that haven't invested in funds before, explaining the mechanics of how these funds work. And it is a bit different to a lot of other things. It's almost like sort of averaging into the VC fund. I don't know how to really put it. And so you do sort of end up learning, I guess, over time. At what point in those conversations are you like, well, okay, this person probably isn't going to invest. And a lot of our probably good, high net worth type investors, it's there's people would be they're in for 150. And that's because they've just gone, look, I can allocate 50K a year for 3 years. And if they're, savvy and friendly and they're not going to be too much of a pain, you go, yes. If they're going to be a real nuisance, you go, look, I don't think we can invest, I don't think we have a minimum check size of 250 or 300 or whatever it is. Some VC funds in Australia have, 100 plus investors. Some have, under 20. And they can be the same size fund, but have very, very different numbers of actual investors. And there's upsides and downsides of having lots of investors.
Yeah.
Compliance. Life is compliance.
I bet. I mean, you've touched on a couple of things as well, but I think there's so many interesting parallels between the two for founders, especially, given that it is a little bit of a grind. I think when James was speaking about it, he's at the end of the first year, it's yeah, this is tough, but we'll kind of get through. After the second year, it's this is getting really, really tough to keep going. For founders who are, I guess, in that particular situation, are thinking about fundraising or are going through that at the moment and potentially don't have the luxury of getting 900K checks just thrown at them,
If you have a 900K check, please send it straight to me. Put the address in the show notes, right?
Absolutely. Any advice for founders who are going through that process at the moment to, I guess, keep the dream alive?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's hard. And I think what's really hard is it's kind of the same problem in some ways, like, not to bring everything back again, but like it's kind of the same problem as bootstrapping. One of the hardest parts about bootstrapping in the early days is it's really not clear if it's ever going to work. And I think that's to a degree why people, and I've always said, like, it's so annoying the way that like the media treats, fundraising as such this big success story and all that kind of stuff. But in some ways, it's like the benefit of the fundraising piece is like it's a very clear public signal that you've been able to persuade someone of its value, right? And I think it's, in bootstrapping very hard because you absolutely, like, again, like I meet a lot of people where it's like they've just smashed away at an idea for years and years and years and you're like, this is just not going to work. And how do you say that to them? And how do you say that to them when it's like, probably if you said that to me early on, I'd be like, yeah, stuff you, like, I'm going to go and do it anyway. And it worked out, all right? And, like, it worked out okay for me. So, like, at what point do you actually say, well, maybe you've tried too hard? And James and I probably had 2 or 3 times in that fundraising conversation where we were like, are we done here? Have we hit the wall? Have we been able to, it was absolutely a struggle to persuade enough people to part with enough money because, the nature of the way the legislation works in Australia is you have to have at least 10 million bucks in your VC fund to do a proper institutional VC fund. And that comes with certain tax benefits for investors. And so, you sort of want to do that if you can. And so, as a result, like, it's an absolute grind to get to that point because it's a minimum threshold. Like, you can't operate until you reach the minimum threshold. And so, it is, I think, it's really hard to know when you should give up. I think it's a really hard decision for every founder, whether it's of an operating company or a fundraise or whatever it is. It's like it's so hard to know. When we first went out to go and raise, I remember we spoke with one of the tier 1 VCs here who was like, "It'll take you 2.5 years, 3 years." And we were like, "Nah." That may have been the case back when you raised your first fund. Back when it was a nascent startup community. It was all new and we didn't have all these people, and it'll take us like 12 months. And they're like, "Oh yeah, right. We'll see." And sure enough, they were 100% right and we were 100% wrong. And so I think there is a little bit of that, just sort of like, hindsight and, the way that you do it. And I don't know, like I still don't have a good answer as to when you should give up. I think it's I think it's a really hard question. And kind of the basic part of it to me is like, I think you give up when you're sick of it. And James and I never quite, we got frustrated, but we never quite reached the point where we were like, I'm done with this. We never quite reached that point of just like so frustrated that you just want to like smash your head against the wall. There are definitely very frustrating, irritating moments. There are a lot of maybes that we thought were yeses that turned into nos. And, like, again, same story as every founder that raises capital for a company, exactly the same set of, same process, same set of things. And, lots and lots of lessons you learn over the way about, who you pitch when and all that kind of stuff. But I just don't have a good answer as to when you should give up. Whether it's running a company, whether it's raising a fund, raising a round, I don't have a good answer.
Is there anything, James, you used to ensure that you didn't give up, or to kind of ensure that, I guess you were able to move past the frustrating?
I just hate saying no. I think for me, it's just like it's the for better or worse, probably mostly worse over the long run. But like it's that avoidance of that sense of like personal failure. And refusal to acknowledge that something hasn't worked, or to acknowledge that you can't do something, which is just a terrible, terrible answer to give because it's like it's just exactly what breeds that thing of like I will never give up on this. But like I think both of us have a fairly similar view, and just like we just we're quite sort of pig-headed in that sense, in that we sort of, and you've probably asked my partner that and he'll probably tell you the same thing, is that, I'm not a big believer in saying no about things. In the same way I'm not a big believer in saying that, you're not qualified or you're not able to do something. I'm like, no, stuff it. Like there's been tons of times in my career where I'm like, I should not be in this room. But I've been there, and you just have to go, well, I'm there now. So
yeah. Is that something you look for in founders? For Galileo? I think the best founders often have that, but not always. Sometimes you also meet with founders where it's like they're actually they don't realize how good a thing they're onto. And sometimes actually those founders are the most personally rewarding, because it gives you a lot more. I guess it gives you a lot more from a purely me sense. Like, it gives you a lot more personal leverage to be like, oh well, actually, like I can help this founder realize that actually they're onto a really good thing. So not necessarily exclusively, but I think ultimately founders, and it is again, I jokingly describe it as like startups are a form of BDSM, because it's like you learn as a founder, it's like you love it, and there's parts you hate about it, but you love the parts that you hate, and it's just this like continuous process where it's just like and I think you need to have that no matter whether
you really believe in it consciously at the time, like I think you really need to have that approach, because the reality is like running a business, whether it's a like cafe or a startup or a bootstrapped company, whatever, it's a really, really shit thing to do. It's awful. You know, no matter all of the things about how do we support founders' mental health and how do we support XYZ, and it's just awful, you know, and it's just like it will, you know, business just takes and takes and takes and takes, like, oh my God, like takes everything that you hold dear to your heart, like relationships, it takes a sense of joy, holidays, like, and it's just like you've got to, I think most of the founders that I know, and, you know, through programs like Startup Fix Growth Club, most of the founders that I know, you know, they're the sort of people where they're like, yeah, like isn't it just absolutely effing awful, but we're all here because we bloody well love it. And so I think that's where it's like, you know, you see perhaps less of like people that refuse to say no, but it's more, I think, people that actually find joy in the awfulness, or, you know, find satisfaction in the awfulness is really what it is. Because I think that the really hard thing is, you know, you can't have a business without the founder. Just almost never works. And so, you know, what you really want to avoid, I guess, as an investor, from, again, speaking from an investor's lens, what you want to avoid from an investor, and as a founder, is probably a good thing too, but like you want to avoid that moment where it's like the founder's just like, I'm done with this. I'm sick of it. You know, like it's ruined that last holiday. You know, for the last time I've had to cancel all of my plans because something's gone wrong at, you know, 11 o'clock at night before I'm about to go out to the club or whatever. You know, you sort of end up, so I'd say we more probably select towards founders that are like, they have that, I guess, understanding or that experience of like, oh, you know, and whether it is that, you know, they've struggled to raise their first round, or whether it's that they've gone through some sort of like adversity through the business or whatever it is, it's just like, otherwise it's like, you know, your life in startups is a roller coaster. And I think one of the hardest things to do as a founder is to separate your feeling of personal success from that of the business. And that's, I think, a very hard thing to do. And I think when we talk about a lot of the sort of founder mental health stuff, so I'm like, a lot of it for me, at least on a personal level, is like that balance of how do you actually separate your feeling of, you know, personal satisfaction and sense of self and all that kind of stuff from the business, knowing that a big part of what actually makes you get through the hard times of the business is that it is so heavily tied to your, like, you know, sense of individuality and everything like that, that it's like, you know, you don't want it to die because you don't want your child to die, right? And so I think it's like, it's a really hard balance to draw, because at the same time, you don't want people to get so obsessed with it that obviously, you know, things go wrong. Like, you know, and you don't necessarily want to have people having, you know, like massive mental health issues and breakdowns and all that kind of stuff. You know, that's a very, very bad outcome. But at the same time, I think as a founder, like, you can't be a founder and be like, oh yeah, you know, like something goes wrong and I'll just like be like, oh yeah, I'll look at that, you know, in 3 days. You know, like I think that approach often doesn't breed a good outcome. And there's very few business owners that I know, whether it is of, you know, a cafe or whatever it is, through to startups. There's very few founders / business owners that I know that don't have that exact approach. Very, very few.
Hugh, amazing to have you on the podcast today. And I'm sure that for the people listening, they took a lot out of this. For anyone that wants to either write you a 900K check or get potential funding from Galileo, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Hit up our website, Galileo.Ventures. We have we build our own technology, you know, like very proud, you know, build my own tech inside a VC fund, which is kind of weird. So we have our own for startup founders. We have a really exciting, you know, application form. It's very exciting. It's written in Next.js. So I'm like, oh, I've used all this sexy new technology. Start a quick application, takes about 10 minutes, or send us an email. But, you know, that's the easier way because it injects you straight into our Airtable, and that, you know, runs all these processes and things. Helps us make sure you don't get lost along the way. Or send me an email at any point. Always happy to help. You know, like I think, you know, the other approach that James and I both have in terms of our, I guess, role in the ecosystem is also just purely that no matter whether we fund the company or not, you know, like Galileo wins if the ecosystem wins. That'll generate more investors for us, generate better startup stories, generate a lot more interest, you know, all those things. And so we're very happy to help with, you know, might not be a fit for us, but we're very happy to say, oh, look, I think you'll actually be a great fit for XYZ. Like, let me do an intro to XYZ fund or XYZ person or whatever it is. We're always very, very happy to do that. You know, and that's, you know, what I spend a lot of my life doing. That's what I like doing about Galileo. You know, I like being able to help people and like being able to help startups. So we're both, I think, very passionate about that, and, you know, very happy to give, you know, very, very opinionated, happy to give views. I won't always profess that my views are right, but certainly happy to give an opinion.
Awesome. I will make sure those links are in the show notes. Once again, Hugh, thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 138 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.